Okay, so welcome to this Inclusive Education Canada Roundtable. The title of tonight's discussion is Letting Children Down, the Shame of Partial School Attendance in Canadian Schools. And we know that the practice of forcing children to attend school for only part of the day can have a detrimental effect on their educational, social, and emotional development. It also has a significant and negative effect on their families. And it's a concern that should be shared by all, especially teachers, educational leaders, policymakers, and families. It leads to limited school hours, can disrupt the child's continuity of learning, hinders engagement in school activities, can contribute to a child's feeling of isolation and exclusion and stigma for being signaled out for partial attendance, and have a long-term effect on the child's self-image and confidence. And of course, there's the effect on parents and the family. Inclusive Education Canada initiated a survey to invite families that have this experience with partial day attendance, either planned or by phone call day by day when a parent may be asked to come to school and take a child home. So in either case, we want to hear from parents about their experience. And so far, in the last week and a half to 2 weeks, we've heard from 100 parents from all across the country. And we're going to leave that survey open for a few weeks, sometime in July at least. And then we plan to look at the results and prepare a report to release this fall. Coincidentally, the New Brunswick child youth advocate, Kelly Lamrock, who's one of our guests tonight, released his report on this issue just a few days after we launched our survey. And it couldn't have come at a better time. While Mr. Lamrock's report is focused on New Brunswick, it has national resonance we want to explore. Our panel will share perspectives on the issue and will invite and respond to as many questions and comments as we can. And you can post those on the chat option or the Q&A option in your Zoom connection. So at the end of the session, we'll remind you again that we're doing a survey and we invite parents and families to join and share your experiences in our survey. But now let me introduce our guests. First of all, and I would ask them to turn their cameras on, and you'll be able to see them as I introduce our guests. First, Bruce Yuditsky, who is a former CEO and Executive Director of Inclusion Alberta. Bruce is a parent and has been an advocate for many years for inclusive education. Leslie Trudell, former teacher, resource teacher, school district official, and currently a professor and associate dean of education at the University of Winnipeg. Kelly Lamrock, who's the New Brunswick child youth advocate. He's a former minister of education in New Brunswick and a lawyer who's focused on human rights issues during his legal practice, and a well-known advocate for children and youth and inclusion, I might add. And finally, Diane Richler, who's the moderator of tonight's discussion. She's a former executive vice president of Inclusion Canada and currently leads inclusive education efforts of Inclusion International and has been active globally in supporting the effort to make schools inclusive. So with that, I'll turn things over to Diane, and she will lead our panel in this discussion on partial day attendance at school. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you very much, Gordon. And I appreciate the fact that you commented on the timeliness of the report from Kelly Lamrock. I think so many families are facing the situation of their children officially being on partial days where the school system is only allowing them to come to school for partial days, while others are facing the situation of never knowing when the phone rings if it's a call to take their child home from school. And the devastation that parents feel about the rejection of their children, just from an emotional perspective, together with the fact that their children are being denied an education, and parents often cannot work when they're constantly needing to be by the phone, waiting to be told to bring their children home. So just the fact that this issue has been raised both by Inclusive Education Canada and by Kelly Lamrock, I think is really important. I think it's also really worth noting that although the report by the child advocate focuses on New Brunswick, this is not a situation that's unique to New Brunswick. And we're starting to see from the first results to the survey that Gordon mentioned, and the link to the survey has been posted in the chat, that this is an issue that is facing families across Canada. Gordon is the one who organized this session, and he gave me very strict marching orders. And one of those orders was that despite the fact that all of our panelists could really give extensive presentations on the topic at hand, my job is to keep things moving. And I have a stopwatch in front of me, and I'm going to ask a series of questions to each of the panelists. I'm going to give them 5 minutes to answer that question, and then I'm going to turn to the next panelist. I'll do that twice. And then I'm going to allow those of you in the audience to pose questions. You can do that at any time, either on the Q&A function or on the chat function, and we will monitor those and get to you. So after we hear a couple of times from each of our panelists, we will hear what are the most pressing issues on your mind, and then finally we'll turn to Gordon to wrap things up. And the only other thing that I'll ask is that if you're willing to introduce yourself in the chat, we would very much like to know who you are, if you want to share that, what organization you represent, and in particular, where you're coming from, so that we'll have some sense of who our participants are. I just want to mention too that since the report is available and the link to the report was in the announcement for the webinar, and if it hasn't been done already, I'll ask that the links that were in the announcement be posted in the chat as well. So I'm not going to be asking Kelly Lamrock to do a summary of his report. Rather, we're going to just dive into some of the content. And I guess that's why my first question to you, and I hope that no one will mind if I address the panelists by their first names. But so my first question to you, Kelly, I was really struck by the fact that you mentioned that when inclusion became so prevalent in New Brunswick and was really gaining speed, that there were very few children with disabilities who were limited in the amount of time that they were spending in school. And now you've really seen an explosion, if I can call it that, of the number of children who are officially on partial days. Can you comment on that? Why do you think that's happened?
It is an explosion. In fact, it was once explicitly made clear it was illegal. And really 10 years ago, this was extremely rare. I would have numbered it at couple of dozen that I was aware of. The acceleration started in 2014 and it's exploded to over 500 now, as my office found. Some of it is simply that it's been allowed to happen. Before it was not. And oversight and accountability matter. A policy like New Brunswick's 322 is only as good as the willingness of the Department of Education to enforce it. But I think there are other reasons if I were explaining why has this happened, and I would break them into two groups. One is classroom composition and the challenges that teachers and schools are facing, and then a systemic failure to have the resources to deal with those kinds of issues. I think on the composition side, we have seen huge pressures on classrooms and particular classrooms. New Brunswick has seen an influx of new Canadians. That's a good thing, but we have more learners who don't speak English or French. We have seen more students presenting with behavioral needs. Some of that is likely because there has been a breakdown in the resources to provide early interventions. For example, only 6 of 27 school psychologist positions in the English system are filled in New Brunswick today. If there isn't access to edu-psych assessments, if there isn't access to interventions, if resources per capita have declined since 2014, and they most certainly have, then obviously problems that might have at one time been dealt with in early childhood are now lingering until later, and children become, particularly on behavioral issues, more challenging. The other thing is we have to mention it. For a while, New Brunswick had moved the entry point for French immersion to grade 3 because 98% of children from the poorest families and 99% of children with disabilities were in English prime classrooms. The K-2 system, therefore, had one class that had almost no behavioral issues and no special needs, and one had classes where in some cases 2/3 of the class required interventions. When those were separated, New Brunswick's literacy rate reached its highest point of 86%. Students actually found more students took French immersion in grade 3, they persisted longer, and they achieved the same result in French. For political reasons, government went back to resegregating those classrooms based on ability. And then, of course, we saw a number of English prime classrooms that were highly overwhelmed in composition. So all of that is going to be true. Lack of resources, return of streaming, lack of early interventions, more and varied challenges. Then there are the systemic ones. We are now seeing a huge turnover with teachers. The NBTA has made that point very effectively. In some districts, nearly a third of the workforce are teachers with 5 years experience. They're less likely to get the support they need. They have less access to training. We are seeing larger school districts. It was a poor choice, I might respectfully say, when New Brunswick went from a large number of school districts to 4 Anglophone and 3 Francophone ones. You know, we've always very lazily said, well, if there's fewer subunits, we must save money. No one ever tests that assumption. It's like this received wisdom that no one ever actually checks out. And everyone is, oh, fewer secretaries, fewer superintendents. Who feels bad for superintendents? It also means fewer directors of student services. You know, when school districts were small, the director of student services might come right to school. He might know exactly how many children there are. He might actually see them. And she might actually also be able to say to the teacher, what are you doing over there? Why is this happening? Now children can be out of school for months, and the administrative unit is so large that the director never knows and nobody's ever accountable. So when we sort of lazily say, let's just make fewer school districts, we have less individual attention and less accountability on things like policy 322. And New Brunswick has become somewhat nationally famous, has probably been a little distracted with culture war issues, and the department hasn't been in the schools focusing on these kinds of issues, like our people breaking the law and sending kids home. You know, our own education plan says right in it that attendance is a prime target for schools to improve, because when students aren't in school, their academic performance goes down, they're at more risk of adolescent mental health problems, teen pregnancy, substance abuse. There are 2 pages of peer-reviewed research. And yet here's the department also saying, but you know, the most vulnerable kids, we just send them home and forget about them. So I think there are systemic failures and compositional failures. No one meant for this to happen. Schools started doing it because I think they lacked the training, expertise, and resources to know what else to do. And then there was a systemic failure from there.
Perfect. You actually had 16 seconds left and you managed to do that. So great. Given what you've just said, it's perfect timing to turn to Leslie, who, although she's now focused on research and teaching, was an administrator. And Leslie, one of the things that you've written about is the dangerous space between good intentions and meaningful interventions. So when you were operating at the school level and at the system level, what were some of the things that you were able to do to ensure that kids would stay in school for full days?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Diane. And thanks very much to Kelly for writing the report on this topic. It's incredibly important and it's timely. And similar to the work that Kelly's published, the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth has also published a number of reports. And I've worked with some of those reports, both practically as a practitioner and as a researcher. So documenting the decline is one of those that I've referenced in my research and in my work. And more recently in my work on focus on school suspensions. And the quote that you mentioned, Diane, is actually from Documenting the Decline, and it's a document that highlights critical issues in the province's child welfare, child mental health system, and education systems. And the statement between good intentions and meaningful interventions relates specifically to identified shortcomings of all of those systems, which have led to insufficient support for vulnerable children and youth. And the report urged for better integrated and effective strategies to transform intentions into real impactful actions for well-being of children. That's how it reads. Definitely counter to the narrative that we're talking about today with partial school days. So additionally, in Manitoba, we have a provincial document on school presence and engagement. And we also have policy directives on minimizing the use of seclusion and suspensions. And there's a section on children and youth being sent home early for maybe what we might call a reset or a break. So it's not a formal suspension, but it's this break in the day. And the policy directive does speak to that, and it does outline that if a child is sent home due to behavioral reasons, informal removals of this type have to be documented, and a plan must be put in place for the child to return to full-time instruction. So that's the policy, and the policy fulfills the legislation similar to what Kelly talked about. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about the research that I've done. I've done some research with school leaders in Manitoba, principals and vice principals, and they indicated that the use of shortened school days and with students with additional needs is typically done in consultation with families through the individual education planning process. So that sounds very similar to what the policy directive says. And they also told us that in most cases it was considered as a last resort. And when asked about alternatives, however, this was interesting to me. The principals and vice principals found that limited resources and supports from other provincial social systems impacted their ability to engage in important intersectoral partnerships that might provide other possible courses of action. And when I talk about other social systems, I'm talking about child welfare, health, mental health, justice, probation services, etc. And as a former practitioner that both you and Gordon noted about me, I believe it takes a holistic, creative, wraparound team to develop responses to create a full school day, to create full attendance for students. And that was something that I always tried to engage with when we were having challenges in this area. So to give you an example of a situation that I encountered as a practitioner, I had a student that really wasn't successful during that full school day. This is just one example, but we had many. And this one example we were able to capitalize on and use this practice many times over. But the student was unable to fulfill that full day in school. Things would break down. So what we did was we designed creatively some time out in the community. But the challenge was we couldn't have the EA from the school division or district work out in the community because of union regulations. So what we had to do was to do some creative thinking. And we worked with another system to provide us with an individual assistant who could be out in the community with the student for the part of the day that they weren't in school. And so bringing together the morning in school, perhaps an afternoon in the community with a different assistant, and the school division paid for the assistant from the other system. So that was just a creative example of what we did there.
Perfect. You had 3 seconds left. Thank you, Leslie.
You're welcome.
Bruce, you were introduced by Gordon as being a parent, and certainly you are well known as an advocate for parents. What's your experience on how parents and their organizations can address and deal with the situation of partial attendance of their children?
Well, I'm going to speak first more in reference to parents and maybe later a bit more to organizations, if that's okay. We'll see how much time there is. I may not be as timely as the others. And I did want to preference my remark. I did want to preference my remarks because I am going to offer some critical commentary. But I think it's important for parents and others to recognize I've had the privilege, still have, of working with amazing educators, principals, school divisions, who are willing to do whatever is necessary, sometimes as a result of advocacy, but then willing to partner to keep kids in school, to figure it out, to resolve issues and problems. And I want parents to remember that those divisions exist in, or schools and school divisions exist pretty much in every division, which is a reflection of the fact, I think, that the issue, because these schools that are stepping up, and particularly with respect to kids with disabilities, have the same resources, the same complexity, the same quality of teachers, etc. And yet they're able to step up, step forward, work collaboratively and cooperatively, and do everything that they can to bring the resources to bear to keep kids in school or to extend their school days. I think the issue that Kelly was referring to is much more one of this systemic growth in partial exclusion, which sometimes leads to full exclusion. And I believe that's much more a question of school division leadership and values held by that leadership than it is classroom complexity, for example, or expertise, because that can be found and brought to bear. I'm going to suggest for parents that there is obviously a power imbalance. It's your child's life when you approach a school. To a school, they can be caring, but it's not quite the same as it being their child's life or their child's future that's at stake. And so wherever possible, my advice, our advice often is that where there is an organization like Inclusion Alberta or in your community that has the capacity to provide advocacy, to accompany you to a school meeting, you capitalize upon that. An advocate at a school meeting can help you to take notes, to speak up when your emotions overtake you, for example, and is potentially aware of other resources that can be brought to bear. Now, that isn't yet always possible or available. And in that instance, I would suggest it's best, if you can, to bring someone who supports you, a friend, for example, who is there to stand with you. Simply having someone else in the meeting observing, for example, the behavior of school officials and taking notes of what's being said can change and alter the behavior of the school administrators to be more respectful if that hasn't been the case, to listen better. Plus, given the power imbalance that I mentioned earlier, that schools have with respect to a child being welcome and included, having others there with you doesn't make you feel quite as alone, and sometimes can help to shift the balance of power. If you're in a difficult situation where you're ending up having your child at home or picking them up frequently, and this isn't something you think is appropriate, it's important to begin to document everything. Keep records of all the communications, for example, but do not bombard the school with emails. I've never known a complex situation to be resolved by repeated emails going back and forth. into which people read all kinds of emotions that may not have been intended, and it likely, creates more antagonism or burns more bridges. These are complex issues. They require face-to-face meetings and problem-solving strategies being brought to bear between families and school administrators and those in a position to assist schools. The next point is a bit controversial.
Just one
and-
quick point, Bruce, and then I've got to cut you off.
Yeah. Okay. It's a bit controversial because partial school days are not recorded or documented as in Manitoba. You might want to ask, in effect, they are in a way illegal, as Kelly alluded to. You might want to ask for a formal suspension because those are documented and recorded, can be appealed, and require a means of addressing the reasons for that suspension. Parents do need to know their rights. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Some really good advice. I'm going to go back to Kelly. And Kelly, you mentioned, and your report refers to policy 322, which those people from outside New Brunswick may not realize is guidance for the province on what inclusion means. And it provides guarantees of inclusion. But I'm wondering how you think your report can be relevant in other jurisdictions in Canada that don't have something equivalent to policy 322.
What I'm hearing from my colleagues across the country is that it is relevant. I think there's a couple of reasons. One, in New Brunswick, the policy is excellent, and that's the work of a number of leaders in the system over a number of years. But the policy is only as good as the enforcement, and that didn't happen in this instance. The other thing is, I'm happy to say the common law has largely caught up with New Brunswick's policy. I think it was remarkable at one time, and for the best reasons, especially post the Jeffrey Moore decision and decisions like Churchill and Newfoundland. The common law is catching up. You have to be able to show some kind of due diligence and undue hardship in order to explain not only just removal from the common learning environment, but if you're going to have portions of a day with no services, you better be prepared to explain without going to finances why you couldn't do that. What we found in our report was somewhat shocking, and I think one of the important parts in the report is when I asked the department, where's the legal authority for this? Children have to be in school. I'm looking at the Education Act. I don't see any authority for partial days. This isn't a variation, because if children are home without services, that's not a variation of the common learning environment. That's a nullification. If they change my sandwich from beef to chicken, that's a variation. If they say you have no sandwich and you got to go home hungry, that's not a variation. That's a nullification. And what's interesting is the department said, well, it's undue hardship, because look at how hard it is to accommodate this child in the classroom. I said, well, first of all, in these files, I'm not seeing the due diligence that would establish undue hardship. You went right from there's a problem, the problem is difficult, therefore that's undue hardship. Where's the evidence that you looked at alternatives, all the things Bruce and Leslie talked about? What options did you explore? What training did you look at? What resources did you look at? Did you look at creative plans to accommodate the student? And schools were just not doing that, and nobody's requiring that. But also, undue hardship, even once you remove, even if I granted that, that explains why the child's outside the learning environment. It doesn't explain the absence of services, and that can't be justified by the undue hardship of including them in the common learning environment. That kind of disastrously awful understanding of the process isn't just a legal problem, but I think it goes to some of the things Bruce is talking about. The reason there's a process to establish undue hardship is often in saying, well, what might we do to accommodate the student? You actually require people to come up with creative solutions and things like what Leslie talked about. When you just skip that and you allow schools to skip that, you go to the path of least resistance. And I do think that is, I wish I could say it's all values, but I don't think there's been an explosion in people with bad values over the last 10 years in the New Brunswick school system. I think something else must be driving it. I suspect teachers have roughly the same values they did 10 years ago. But I think things are getting more difficult. Then there was a lack of oversight, there was a lack of training, and suddenly the path of least resistance just started occurring. What what do we do about that? Well, for one, I think policy 322, we've provided a legal guide to teachers, because I think one thing we've sometimes done as an inclusion, we're so afraid of going back to the past that we sometimes leave a public perception, and with new teachers, they may default to the public perception of, well, it's a binary choice. Either we just accept the status quo with the class being disrupted and everyone being upset to an unacceptable level, or we hold our nose and send the child home. That's never the binary choice. And I think sometimes vagueness is not our friend. We sometimes are so afraid people will skip out on the test, we don't enunciate the test. And you have to go through these steps. If you do go through those steps, and then you get to an intervention that is tested, therapeutic, and targeted and temporary in the short term, as Leslie said, Manitoba's policy calls for it, you can do that. And I think helping people understand how to do that is important, because if people perceive it as a binary choice, we may just default to partial days. And so we're training teachers in schools. We've developed, that's why I did a legal guidance memo. We are also training parents in the kind of advocacy Bruce correctly talked about. We're going to start doing seminars, because I think that sort of instant accountability from empowered parents is a tremendous tool in checking the growth of these things. And so we've got to make sure that we're giving tools in that way. So 322 happily, frankly, even if we went back to Eaton, and I'll make this last point because I'm getting close, you know, there were a lot of problems with the Eaton decision, and I think Moore has started to move us in a more progressive direction. But one thing I said in New Brunswick is, if you look at what the school did even in the Eaton decision, when they were allowed to vary the common learning environment, most of the files I looked at, the school wouldn't even meet the Eaton test for due diligence. And we've got to start holding people to that.
Thank you. Excellent. Leslie, I'm going to ask you to build on something in Kelly's report, because he specifically recommended that regular reviews of the school's inclusive environment would be a good companion step to his recommendations. And I'm wondering if you have suggestions on how such reviews could be conducted.
Yeah, thanks for that, Diane. I would fully agree with reviews, regular reviews of inclusive environments in schools, basically to ensure that inclusive practices are appropriately and continuously improved. So I guess the question would be, how does that happen? I can speak to how it happens in my jurisdiction. The Department of Education and Early Childhood Learning here in Manitoba engages in a triennial process once every 3 years. That's a regular review and reporting process. And I mean, that's a way of doing it, but I guess my question would be, is that process identifying the concerns that we've outlined here today? So that's a question that remains for me. Within that reporting, that review and reporting process that we do here, I would say there's a greater need for a focus on data and data-informed decision-making. School suspensions, for example, are tracked, and that data is addressed with school boards at the school board meetings. But what if students are being sent home and it's not a formal suspension and it's a break or a reset? Is that being collected, and is that being communicated? So obviously there's a need for documentation around that practice and information on the planning that needs to follow up so that partial days don't become the norm. Second to that, I think involving a diverse group of partners, I'll call them. So in addition to teachers and administrators, including students themselves, parents, community members, as part of that review process, could offer really valuable insights into the progress and effectiveness around inclusive practices. In particular, looking at areas to highlight for improvement. And I think an outside view or an outside lens on that process would be more effective than the lens of the school staff alone. As well, the findings from reviews can inform targeted professional learning initiatives. It can identify gaps and challenges in specific practices that would allow schools and divisions to really tailor their training sessions to address specific needs. I think it would ensure that teachers are more well equipped to support diverse learners, because you can see those areas that are going to be emerging or trends that are happening in schools. And that would help to support diverse learners in the common learning environment or in a more creative learning environment that I referred to before. And finally, I think a regular review process could definitely reveal where resources are most needed, whether it happens to be additional staff, whether it's configuration of staff. And when I talk about that, I mean not having educational assistance always with students, but maybe using the budget dollars for EAs and combining it to purchase psychology time, speech pathology time, maybe having additional classroom teachers to co-teach in classrooms, so that you are able to meet the needs of students in a more effective way. And perhaps there might be some identified specialized training needed or some new instructional materials. But all of this speaks to that idea of efficient and effective allocation of resources to support best practices and definitely those legislated requirements.
Thank you. Very helpful. I'm going to turn now to Bruce, and then we have lots of questions that have come in from our participants. But Bruce, you suggested in your first comments that first you would focus on parents particularly, and then now maybe I'm wondering if you could focus on the role of organizations like Inclusion Alberta, Inclusion Canada, and members at the local level.
Yeah, I'll attempt to do that, certainly. I think one obvious thing that flows from the report is tracking this across the country. So every educational jurisdiction should be tracking this, because it becomes a hidden form of exclusion. And while I only get to advise Inclusion Canada and not decide for them, I'm fairly certain they'll attempt to address this with the Council of First Ministers of Education, press the issue with them and the necessity to help remedy this. I also believe we may need a national advocacy campaign to both highlight those educators actually who are, as I said before, stepping up, providing quality education, solving problems, working collaboratively with parents and other partners in the community, and have their voice become more resonant in public. I tend to think they go about their work relatively quietly behind the scenes. And so it's these kind of issues that gain prominence and on which we shine a spotlight, but we also need educators that don't abide by these practices to speak up, step up, and be there in support of families seeking a quality, inclusive education, just as we have to raise a greater degree of public consciousness about supporting inclusive education for all children and how this benefits, in fact, every child that's in that classroom and in that school. Inclusion Canada is a federation of member organizations across the country. I think we should be more effective, find additional resources to provide needed advocacy to support parents, be better able to train parents in necessary advocacy schools. And organizations like Inclusion Alberta have inclusive education consultants that actually go into schools, work with teachers, help to problem solve, adapt curriculum, figure out instructional processes. And that's another resource potentially we can bring to bear to a much greater degree than is currently the case. So it doesn't fall exclusively to school to solve every complex issue. I do think there is an issue, as Kelly's pointed out, when departments of education don't require school divisions to abide by the legislation that exists and in some degree allows this kind of issue we're talking about to happen with impunity. They're and Kelly mentioned the Eaton case, which was a legal case, there could be a need to be supportive of or provide assistance in a parent's pursuit of a legal challenge that has national implications. The Eaton case was some time ago. The Supreme Court has sometimes changed its mind about previous decisions, and we could, if we had a case that actually had some consequences and directed school divisions and departments of education, that might prompt both remedial action and maybe inhibit others from continuing to deny children with disabilities their right to an education. I think I'll mention one controversial, I only have a few seconds left. Quickly, I think Kelly's right, the values haven't changed, but that in effect is a problem because its inclusion is still not ordinarily occurring over the course of the lifetime of a child with intellectual disabilities, for example. And there isn't a logical leap from we're struggling to accommodate a child in a common learning environment and a regular classroom to, well, they shouldn't be in school at all. There's something there that suggests there ought to have been more action to accommodate that child in different ways. Michael Fullen, a prominent Canadian education expert, once said, teachers need to be moral agents of change. I think that applies here.
Thank you. And just as a follow-up to what you said, the Eaton case happened before Canada was a party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And since that time, Canada has received criticism of its adherence to Article 24 of the Convention, which calls for inclusive education, and has also been chastised by the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I think we do have a more solid base for taking a case forward. So
I agree. I agree.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to questions. We won't get to all the questions that have been posed, but I'm going to start with one that we received in advance of the webinar, and a concern that was raised as to whether if a test were established, could that lead to more requests for alternative learning sites? The possibility of not needing a child to be in the common learning environment. And also related to that, curious about your wording about the best interest argument, because when it comes to discussions, for example, about supported decision-making, legislation is actually moving away from that type of language. So Kelly, I wonder if you could address those two issues. Are we at risk of opening the door to more permission for placement outside of the common learning environment? And is there a danger to using the best interest language?
I'll start with the first one because I think that's easier. I think you are never at risk of getting what you don't want if you describe what you want. And I think the greatest risk of getting what you don't want is if you are so vague that almost anything goes. I would also say I think the greatest risk of backsliding to unacceptable days when there were alternate learning sites and children by label were simply grouped together regardless of their interests or basic decency is if people who would like to go back to those days are able to convince people there's a binary choice. If those voices of the past and those voices who want to just say this is discipline, it's time to get our classes back and all the stuff that you do hear from politicians, if those folks are able to convince the electorate that this is a binary choice, I get that, and I've had a lot of response from my report. I would people, don't you understand that, I've had those letters. My son's classroom was evacuated 6 times last week. Are you saying we just have to put up with that? And I keep saying, on what page in my report did I say that? Because I don't remember saying that. But I think somebody's convinced you there's a binary choice, that everybody who says you can't just send children home must want them in the classroom no matter what, and with exactly the process you're seeing. And so I think if people are able to convince the public that that's the only two options, then that political constituency becomes dangerous. And I go back to what I said at the start. You never are at risk of getting what you don't want if you are clear about what you want. And the reason why I've been very clear about here is when you can use short-term therapeutic and temporary and targeted interventions, like the kind Leslie talked about, like the kind that we've seen work. You know, for instance, I remember there was one middle school that had in 3 or 4, they were all boys in this case, who did not learn well in the environment. And they actually did create programs that were enriched, enhanced, targeted, while still making sure they were included in the social mainstream and were in the common learning environment for most of the day, while allowing things that matched their learning style. I think in that particular case, there's a lot of experiential learning. And they did so after looking at a number of things. There were actually additional resources. So I think the reason why I've been very clear, if you show due diligence, if you truly look at all the different environments, if you do not use the cop-out of I didn't have resources, I've said to schools, I'd better see, if you're going to say you didn't have the resources, I'd better see you asked. If you say you didn't have the space, I'd better see where you source private sector things. If you said you didn't have an edu-psych assessment, I'd better see where you call private sector psychologists. I'd better see all the models you did for how you could have this child in the common learning environment. And if you've done that, and you've proposed something that is acceptable, that is okay. But if you don't offer that path, you're going to make it very easy for people to say, well, there must be a binary choice, because I think everyone who tells me that I have to do better is just wanting what's unacceptable. So if you don't want what you don't want, describe what you want. Otherwise, people will misinterpret it. Best interest of the child, I would say this. I continue to start from this point, which is, who would ever do anything that isn't in the best interest of the child? If you can't make the case that your action is in the best interest of the child, whose interests are you serving? And I think, again, this comes down to that thing I say was, if there's something you don't want, then articulate what you want. I believe what we have effectively communicated as a community over the years is that the best interests of the child are not simply as used to be seen as, well, you know, if they're not doing well in the common learning environment, it must be in their interest to go somewhere else. No, that's not true. It's not in their interest. And when people will often say to me, but, you know, I was told it was in my interest I was told it was in my best interest 40 years ago to go into the segregated classroom. My answer is, yeah, that's not a problem with the test. That's a problem with the answer. The question was right. The answer was wrong. And I think we have to fight it on the basis of the answer, because I look, in my job, I start with the basic tenet of the United Nations Convention, that we have a responsibility to children to act in their best interest when they don't have capacity to act for themselves. And I think sometimes when people say, I don't like the result, I don't think you don't like the question, what's in the child's best interest. I think I think you're making a case the answer was wrong.
Thank you. Leslie, I'm going to turn to you with another question that came in from our participants. And this was also something that Kelly had addressed in his report. I'm just going to read it to you. In our advocacy efforts, we're hearing from educators who try to step up and create change that they're suffering repercussions and even losing their jobs. How do we protect teachers and educational assistants who understand that things need to be done differently?
That's a tough one. Never happened for me, and with the folks I worked with, hopefully. It certainly sounds like more collaboration needs to happen, more communication, more teamwork, hearing individual perspectives from different segments. Like I said, when you bring the team together, it's not just the administrators and the teachers speaking, but it's the parents, it's the community members, it's everyone, it's the students themselves coming to the table with you. And I think when Kelly talked about, what is in the child's best interest, I think that's why we're there. That's why we're together. And if we're all operating on that premise, than if you're losing your job because you're operating in what you believe is a child's best interest. I think that's a very sad state of affairs here in Canada today.
Kelly or Bruce, do you want to comment on that?
The only thing I'll say quickly is 2 points. One, most child advocates have the same flaw as I do, that obstruction of an advocate's investigation, which has been held to be for stopping workers from making complaints, including teachers, of a criminal offense in the country. And when I've had to, I've reminded people at the top of the org charts, remember, this is a criminal offense. I will not hesitate to make a referral to the Attorney General. Your employees need to be free to talk to me. So we are one example. I know Manitoba, as Leslie said, has that language. The one other thing I would say is I love Bruce's quote about teachers have to be moral agents. No one should lose their job. I have gently, and this by no means is universal, but I have sometimes heard this of, well, when I've gone into school, said, why is this happening? So I said, well, if I ask that, I'd lose my job. Said, well, let's not be too quick to go there, because sometimes that becomes a bit of a way to remain passive. No one's asking anyone to set their hair on fire and be rude. But we all have to act as moral agents, as Bruce said, within the capacity of our authority. And I sometimes say to teachers, think of me a little like Gordon Ramsay when he comes in and talks to the waitress. And if the waitress says, look, I told the chef this was bad, he moves on and yells at the chef. If you said, here's what I need to make this work, and you documented it and you put it respectfully on the file, and you got a no, I'll go upstairs. If you just sent the child home and you didn't bother to ask, just the perception that it might be unwelcome you've got to push a little bit. I'm not asking anyone to go get fired, but I'm not sure everybody is immediately at danger of losing their job just because they say, I don't have the resources to do this and I'm afraid we're breaking the law. I think that's a fair expectation of people.
Thank you. Bruce, did you want to comment on that before I take the next question?
Just briefly, I think I haven't heard of anybody losing their job, but I found it really depends on the school or school division you're working within. Some are very inviting of critical thinking, of collaboration, and see differences of opinion contributing to a greater end, actually, while others can be suppressive of dissenting voices and differing opinion, particularly around the inclusion of kids with disabilities or behavior challenges. So the culture from school to school and school division can vary substantively. And in my view, as an entirety or a profession, entity or a profession, I'm not sure educators have done as much as they could to create an open environment for this kinds of difficult discussions. But I want to note that with respect to the convention, the CARPD, the UN Convention on Persons with Disabilities, best interest is always contained within the context of inclusion. The moment you step out of that context, best interest doesn't apply. There isn't a binary choice, as Kelly's already articulated quite well.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to one more question, then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to make a closing statement. This was posted in the Q&A, and it says, it's from Chantal, a New Brunswick parent and lead Canadian volunteer for the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. She particularly addresses it to you, Kelly, but I'd like all of you to answer it. Is it legal for my daughter's education to be contingent on restraint and seclusion being in her safety plan in quotation marks? My daughter has not been educated for 18 of the last 24 months because she is not safe at school with untrained staff.
Well, in fact, because it's a New Brunswick question and because I have such confidence in my excellent co-panelists to address the obvious legal protections that should and are there, part of my credibility in New Brunswick is I don't do investigations by hot takes. So if you're going to ask me about a particular situation in New Brunswick, the credibility in my office is that I investigate.
Okay. You may recuse yourself from that. Bruce, how about you?
Well, I don't think it's been established clearly. Of course, we believe it's illegal as well as immoral. And we currently have a case proceeding quite slowly over some years now, still moving forward, brought by parents against the school and school division where their child was locked into an exclusion room and left there for some period of time and ended up in a horrific situation as a consequence. Clearly, it's not educational. And if you're repeatedly using seclusion, you're obviously not finding a way to solve the problem. So, but we have yet to see, for example, police or RCMP ordinarily charge a school or division because a parent filed a complaint about their child's restraint or seclusion. At least I haven't.
Okay. There was a recent case in Ontario of a child who was left unattended and then found to have died, even though they were not supposed to have been left alone. So we haven't seen what the legal repercussions of that will be. Leslie, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, certainly in Manitoba, we do have a policy on seclusion. So, I can provide that information in the chat to refer to if anyone would like to look at that. But I guess my process would be if I were back in my role as a student services administrator or assistant superintendent, I would have been meeting with the parent, meeting with Chantel and talking about, what are some of those situations that are causing her daughter to be unsafe? And then what could we agree on so that we could develop a safety plan that would be in the best interest of the student, of Chantel's daughter, and so that Chantel could agree and feel comfortable with that, and so that the school division could feel comfortable with having Chantel's daughter coming to school. And then we would work with that. I mean, that is simply how we do business. It is collaborative. It is, ensuring that everyone's voice is heard, and it is ensuring that we can move forward positively.
Thank you. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just make a closing statement, anything that you didn't get to say or any summary, and we'll go in the reverse order of the way I asked the question. So Bruce, first to you.
To be honest, I've been at this for 40 plus years now, and I think things have become highly problematic, as Kelly said earlier, that we were moving forward to a much greater degree previously, and we need to put the brakes to the sliding back that's taking place and figure out collectively how to move forward in the interests of children. I would remind people that schools remain, and I'm generalizing, of course, the most resistant to inclusion with respect to any other sector in our society. So we can include children much more readily in post-secondary education, adults in employment, in youth employment outside of school hours, in recreation activities, in preschool. It suggests to me that more schools and educators need to catch up to the rest of the community.
Thank you. Leslie.
I did want to swing back to a quote by the Manitoba Advocate, and that person said, when professionals are delivering services to children, they hold an incredible privilege to ensure that the services that they provide help children build the skills that support and protect them as they emerge into adulthood. And that's something that I feel that I could follow. I feel that that is very good advice for anyone to follow, and something that we need to take heed to, because it sounds like that is not where things are at right now across our country, as I'm reading through some of the elements in the Q&A and also in the chat. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Kelly, the last word from you.
Well, thank you to my co-panelists and you, Diane. It's always a pleasure to see you again, and to everyone who came out to virtually to hear this on what's probably a long and hot day. I guess I would only say to people, you know, the work we do in our community matters. Sometimes it feels frustrating, but if you look at the arc of change, you know, I'm 54, and if I go back to where we were when I was 6 or 7, it hasn't always felt like it in real time, but we make progress, and this is incredibly important. I think the reason why we made this one of our main reports this year is, you know, we can all debate, and this has never been settled in hundreds of years of philosophical debate about the role of the state. How much we owe each other equality of result versus equality of opportunity, good people can differ. But if there's one bloody place in this world where equal opportunity is supposed to be an article of faith, it's the public school system. That public education is really our expression of what we owe every child to have a chance to become fully themselves and to celebrate their strengths. And as these cases started coming in, especially not just the removal from the learning environment, but the removal to nothing. The cases I saw where children spent months, and in some cases years, and in some cases we saw it long enough to know that they didn't return, and the outcomes when they were teenagers, my office saw them again, and some of those stories are in the report. And we saw them again because now the needs have metastasized into things that were truly complex and tragic. Public education is supposed to be what we owe everyone. If somebody goes months without being able to keep up, eventually the odds of them ever returning go down. If we take the toughest cases and the most vulnerable children and they disappear, that is breaking faith with what public education is supposed to be. And if we take children with the highest needs or children with disabilities, children who struggle, and we make them invisible in the communities they're supposed to share with their peers as children, they're going to be invisible in their communities when they're adults. And as people are invisible, it becomes too easy to have a lack of compassion and a lack of political mobilization to lift people up. So this is, a lot of the groups who asked me to speak are from the community of inclusion, and they advocate for people with disabilities. It's not an issue of disability. It's an issue that is fundamentally about what we owe each other as people. And if it's easy to send 500 kids home today, 1 in every 200 in New Brunswick, it's easy to send 1,000 next year. And it's easy to send 2,000. It's easy to start measuring people by how much trouble they are rather than their potential. And so it's 500 kids today, but the principle is universal. You are owed public education. It's what we owe each other. It's what we owe every child. And it's important to dig in our heels. If, as Bruce said, we have to find a test case and push it nationally, I put in my report, I'm going to return to this from a legal perspective if it isn't fixed. It's worth it. And it's not about these 500 kids. It's about anybody who could be excluded because they're too different.
Thank you. I think one sign of hope that I see from this discussion is that we have, excuse me, the child advocate, a public official with a lot of influence, an academic who's also been a practitioner, a parent advocate, who are all on the same page. And I think that clearly this is an issue that can't be solved by any one person, any one office, or any one group of people. It's going to take some consolidated effort. And I thank Gordon and Inclusive Education Canada, excuse me, for raising this, for bringing it forward. People have asked whether questions that haven't been answered will be dealt with. My suggestion will be that as the report on the questionnaire is being developed, and Gordon can speak to this more, that some of the issues raised in this webinar be included in the report, and that as much as possible, some of the questions that were raised could be identified. And I'll leave it to Gordon and the people from Inclusion Canada who are online to figure out what the best way is to get those answers back. So Gordon, I'm going to turn it back to you with my thanks to the panelists. So we see that the chat and the question and answers have been saved for future reference, and they will be looked at. So Gordon, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Diane, and thank you to Bruce, Leslie, Kelly, for what I think is a very timely and insightful discussion. And I want to urge people, if you haven't already, please find your way to the Child Youth Advocate report that Kelly and his office developed. There's a report itself, and in addition, there's a legal guide. The legal guide is focused from a New Brunswick perspective, but I think the substantive part of it is applicable in jurisdictions all across Canada. So please, if you want to find out more about this topic, find his report, find the legal guide, and take a look at them. I also want to acknowledge Kelly's contribution to inclusive education generally in Canada, which happened when he was Minister of Education here. And one of the key things he did, which I have found use of in the years since, is that he and the people he was working with coined the phrase common learning environment. And that was a very useful formulation that helped diffuse the kind of binary choice of being in a regular classroom all the time, no matter what, or being excluded no matter what. And I think that was a very useful phrase that you developed, Kelly, and I'm pretty sure that it was your work, maybe with a few others involved, but you deserve credit for it. A reminder that our survey is online. You can find the links to it on our website or on our social media sites. And this session has been recorded and will be posted on our Inclusive Education website. And you can let others know that if they missed the session, they can find it there. Inclusive Education Canada will continue to follow up on this issue, and we welcome your input and support. You can go to our website, find the contact information for our email, and send something if you want to provide us with a perspective, a question, or a comment. And with that, again, I want to thank our panel. Really pleased with the turnout on a hot summer night in Canada. We don't have a lot of them. And we appreciate you joining us. And thanks again to our panel. And with that, over and out. Thank you.